Canadians are being exterminated. Canada, as we've known it for the past 150 years or so, is well into a systemic genocide implemented by their own colonial government. What I'm about to tell you sounds racist, bigoted, anti-immigrant, but I assure you from all of my content creation, it's not. I hold no hatred toward anyone, for any reason. As an Indigenous person, I have a unique perspective that colonists, settlers, don't have. They're unable to perceive because of their relationship to colonialism and genocide. Though this content presents highly charged language, I'm not holding any position other than the observer. I assure you, I'm not angry. However, if you're a multi-generational farmer, francophone, person of European descent and Canadian citizen, and you identify as a Canadian, what I'm about to tell you may shock you. Gen X Canadians and their 2.5 children and grandchildren are the last generation of Canadian-born Canadians to exist in Canada. In the next 20 to 30 years, Gen X Canadians will die, leaving their 2.5 children and grandchildren. 2.5 children are not enough to replenish the Canadian population, and those children will die in the next 60 years, leaving grandchildren if they have any. The Canadian government has known since the late 80s and early 90s that Canadians are no longer having children, and population was stagnant, even in decline. When I was a child growing up in Winnipeg, there were children everywhere, no matter what street or avenue you were on. In the 70s and 80s, you could see children from age 3 to 13 riding bikes, playing in their front yards, skateboarding, gathering in groups at parks and community centers. In the wintertime, there was the all too familiar sound of pucks hitting the boards while kids were skating and playing hockey. You don't hear that anymore. In those days, the older teens too were seen walking somewhere, going places, or hanging out at a 7-Eleven. There were kids everywhere. It was not uncommon for families to have 4 to 6, even 12 kids in one family back then. We were a part of the legacy they called baby boom. Our parents, who were born shortly before World War II or shortly after. That era, 1950, 1960, in Canada and the United States of America, brought unprecedented change. Women were liberating. They were finally able to open their own bank account, have their own credit card, entering the workforce. And a woman with money and credit meant a woman who is self-determining. Whereas previous to these social changes, women were considered property of men in Canada. It was not uncommon for a wife to wear big sunglasses to hide a black eye, while a fattened, split-open lip was not so easy to conceal. Women were severely oppressed by the patriarchy, and while this description may shock some viewers, these scenarios were all too common in the 70s. But something changed all that. Women began to divorce their abusive husbands. Sometimes they left their children behind, as judges granted more and more women a divorce. By the 1980s, marriages were ending in divorce at an unprecedented rate of 10%. By the late 80s, at an unprecedented and socially shocking level of 50%. It was something we had never experienced in all of Canadian society, where previously no woman ever dared divorce their husband. Women had rights for the first time in Canadian history, and they were asserting them. Part of these rights were personal autonomy and rights to their bodies, and if they did not want to have children, they wouldn't, and they didn't. In Canada, by 1984, we had repatriated our Constitution to include a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, including human and equality rights, and for the first time in history, discrimination was unconstitutional. While Canadians were liberating and emancipating, unionizing, demanding better working conditions, better pay, equal pay, employment equity, harassment-free workplaces, there were a group of people who were resisting these enlightenments. Though we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, our human rights tribunals were deliberately underfunded and complaints went unresolved for up to 10 years or more on average. Thus, human and equality rights remain non-existent, and we only have to look at the sexual harassment complaints by women who worked for the RCMP and Canadian military, where sexual harassment is rampant and unchecked. Manitoba, where I live, we have 2 human rights investigators for a total of nearly 2 million citizens. 1980 to 1990, Canada experienced ongoing recession with increasing inflation. Wages remained stagnant. Food and fuel costs were rising. Shoes were now hundreds of dollars. Social supports were cut and rights were eroded over time. Families now had to have a dual income to make ends meet. Access to health care, education, justice, housing was becoming less accessible, especially for women and girls. Social supports were meaningless. There had been, it appears, some resistance to women's liberation and other Enlightenment movements by the patriarchy. An all-out war was quietly declared on Canadian families. An assault was in full effect, cleverly disguised as repeated recession. Recession after recession pummeled Canadian families, and of course people could see that having children was unaffordable, even with 2 incomes. Population average was now 2.5 children by 1990, and 2.5 children is not enough to maintain Canadian society. People age and leave the workforce. Their children move upward, as their children are still in school. Who will take the jobs left behind? Canada is a colonial system. It is a self-interested system, and a self-interested system could care less about the interests of others, like unions, human and equality rights, women's liberation. Canada let the Canadian family self-destruct to replace it with a new population. The new population comes from fresh off the boat from what morning people call still developing countries, rather than saying they're still in the dark ages. Their cultures are a regression from present-day Canadian society with religions that are profoundly patriarchal. Some of these cultures practice honor killings right here in Canada. This may sound anti-immigrant, racist, or bigoted, but it's not racist to point out the obvious. It is in fact culturally appropriate to learn about other ethnocultural groups and their traditions. There is nothing racist about criticizing Canadian colonialism and Canadian government total neglect and abandonment of Canadian families. Canada could have and should have supported Canadian families when they saw the problem of population decline, but instead saw an opportunity to replace uppity slaves with people acclimated to slavery and Dark Age religious beliefs. Canada abandoned its own heritage and legacy, Canadian citizens, even assaulting them to the point of genocide. Soon everything we have known will be replaced and the Canadian will be extinct. Country music, Canadian classic rock, Canadian farms and rural life, Anne Murray, Stompin' Tom Connors, Alberta cowboys, prairie life, lakes and cottage culture. All of that Canadianism will soon disappear as the first wave of Canadian colonialism is exterminated for demanding a fair country. And it's too late. The numbers tell the tale. It's over for Canadian families. Your legacy has ended, and colonialism deems the Canadian replaceable.